Good evening. Welcome to St. John's. I'm Allison Kavanaugh. I'm the current Women of the ELCA president. We shorten that to WELCA. So thank you for coming tonight. We're so happy you're here, as our series this year is titled, We Belong to One Another. Please feel free to help yourself to coffee while you listen. At this time, I'd like to take a moment to read our land acknowledgement. St. John's Church stands on the ancestral homelands of the Wapakute Band of the Dakota Nation. We respect and are grateful for the generations of Native people who have cared for this land. Just a few announcements before we get started. Tonight's program is being recorded for our Courageous Conversations library of speakers, which you can find on the St. John's website. There are WELCA books at the registration table in the back describing WELCA's work here at St. John's and the contacts for our committees and special groups. Please take one if you're interested in joining in on some of the service projects and activities and field trips that are hosted by the women of our church. We have a free will offering basket at the door. WELCA maintains fiscal independence from St. John's Church, meaning that we take no funding from the church for these programs or many other outreach programs that the women of St. John's carry out worldwide. We'll have a question and answer following the program. You're welcome to step up to the mic with your questions, or if you'd rather, use the slips of paper found at the table. Oh, actually, raise your hand, I was just told. Finally, I'd like to take this opportunity to recognize the members of the Justice and Education Committee of WELCA, Joe Franklin, Don Tomerdahl, Michelle Kramer-Prevost, and Margie O'Laughlin. Are you here, Margie? Okay. I will now invite Joe Franklin to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you to the many women in our organization and to our tech team who continue to support these programs in many ways. Welcome to Courageous Conversations. We will continue over the next 4 months to feature speakers who will offer new perspectives on the theme, We Belong to One Another, through storytelling, music, and the visual arts. We know that the arts can give us a prism to see the other as beloved children of God, reminding us of our shared humanity. The arts can also provide us with tools to respond to injustice, especially at this critical moment in time. Our speaker tonight is a recipient of the Ruth Hansen Palestine Travel Scholarship, sponsored by Northfielders for Justice in Palestine, Israel, otherwise known as NJPI. You will hear more about their work later and can visit their tables in the Commons as you leave. This scholarship is named after our mother. I'm not sure where Julie is, Sister Julie. And since many of you knew Ruth, I feel compelled to share that her eyes were opened in 1968 while on a study tour of the Holy Land. And she dedicated the rest of her life to doing the same for others. She disparaged the otherizing of the Palestinians and often responded with, "You must go over there. Meet the people, get to know them, and see for yourselves." She co-founded NJPI, gave many lectures through Elder Collegium, and led 21 Holy Land tours for over 4 decades. So now I'd like to introduce another person who's carrying forward the work of opening the eyes of others through travel and education. Professor Jason Ripley, a member of St. John's, is a New Testament scholar and professor of religion at St. Olaf College. He has led a number of studies abroad, including a semester class in the Middle East, which inspired Rachel and many others, some of them are here tonight. So it is now my honor to invite Professor Ripley to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Joe. As Joe said, my name is Jason Ripley. I'm a member at St. John's. In my day job, I am a professor of religion up at St. Olaf College. Maybe you've heard of it. I love my vocation because it brings me into community with brilliant, engaged students. It also gives me the opportunity to take students abroad to see all of the beauty and the brokenness of the world. I've had the privilege to experience both of these with our speaker tonight, Rachel Williams. I had the joy of working with Rachel her first semester in college, and she was fantastic. I'm not surprised that she would go on to triple major in religion, economics, and political science, and she just told me tonight with a concentration in Middle Eastern studies. Then, nearly 2 years ago to this day, Rachel and an intrepid group of students who are here with us tonight flew to Jerusalem for a 10-week program on religion and politics in the Holy Land. It was an amazing experience, one that blew your mind, expanded your soul, and broke your heart every single day. When we left, which was the day after the weekend of Passover, Easter, and Ramadan all together, we were all in tears and longing for the time that we could return. And then October 7th happened. And nearly all of us put those hopes and dreams on hold. Rachel did not. She returned last summer to intern at the organization that I think was the most brilliant of the many groups that we had encountered and engaged with in our time there. I am so excited to hear from her tonight, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to introduce you to this truly amazing human being, Rachel Williams.
Hello. Thank you guys all for coming. I remember telling Joe I was a little worried that people weren't going to want to hear what I had to say, but it's glad to see that I was wrong. I'm going to start tonight by telling you a story, and then I'll kind of introduce where I'm going with it. So this past summer, like Jason said, I was working in Jerusalem, and one day we were at the office, and one of my colleagues, Tiferet, says to me, she's like, oh, I have the worst headache ever. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, do you want Tylenol? Like, I have some in my bag. And she's like, no, I'm fine, I've had a headache for like 30 minutes. And I'm like, you've had a headache for 30 minutes, do you want the Tylenol, or like, what are we doing? And she's like, no, I'll just like go lay down if I keep having this headache, but it'll go away. I'll take a nap. And I'm like, that's crazy. I don't think anyone I know would refuse that offer. And she looks at me and she goes, oh, I forgot, you're American. And I said, oh, what do you mean by that? She says, oh, you Americans, you get like kind of sick and you just throw every medication you can find at it. She says, a headache needs some water and maybe a nap and it'll go away. Now, looking back at that story, in the moment I kind of just brushed it off, but I think it's kind of interesting because it seems like such a small problem, right? When you have a headache, you take the Tylenol, you feel better. But the reality is a lot of us, particularly in America, have become accustomed to this feeling of comfort and feeling it all of the time. We've become accustomed to feeling perfectly happy, perfectly healthy, perfectly perfect all of the time. And the reality is that being comfortable is a privilege, and it isn't a privilege that many people around the world have access to. This assumption that we should not only be comfortable all of the time, but that we deserve to be, has made a lot of us very, very bad at being uncomfortable, to the point where it was completely unfathomable to me that she would sit and endure this headache for 30 whole minutes. I just couldn't imagine doing that. So today, we're going to talk about being uncomfortable and why I think it has the potential to be really good. But first, I'm going to introduce myself, third introduction of the night. As you've probably heard, I studied abroad in Jerusalem In the spring of 2023, we traveled all over the West Bank and Israel, and while I was there, we got to study with this organization called PASIA, which focuses on educating mostly foreigners about the Israeli occupation and the effects that has had historically on Palestinian life and continues to have on Palestinian life. And we got to meet with a lot of different Palestinians that lived in Jerusalem and the West Bank, that were politicians, artists, speakers, religious scholars. We met with a farmer, and we got to hear a very wide range of the Palestinian experience. And while I was there, one of the people we heard from was named Salim Munayer, and he gave us a lecture on a peace-building organization he had founded called Musalaha, which means reconciliation in Arabic. He founded this organization during the first Intifada because he felt called to do something, to create change. And after October 7th happened, I had this overwhelming feeling that everything I was doing wasn't enough, that I needed to be doing more. And it just so happened that Musalaha had put out a call for interns, so I applied, and I crossed my fingers, and then a year later, I was there. So I returned this past summer. That's my team at the top, and that's my really small apartment with no AC that I lived in this summer. And I worked at Musalaha, which focuses on reconciliation between Palestinians and Israelis, as well as nonviolent resistance to the Israeli occupation. A really big part of Musalaha is their 6-step reconciliation curriculum that is very integral to their work. And I had the pleasure to get to do research on that, specifically on grassroots organizing and peace building. So today I'm going to touch on both of those experiences. I'm going to pull stories from my time there, and I'm also going to read some journal entries that I wrote while I was there. But I want to preface that the reason I chose to address this talk this way is for 2 reasons, actually. The first is that it's very important to me that you hear this as a personal experience and a witnessing experience. I am not an expert on Palestine. Despite what my concentration might tell you, I'm not an expert on the Middle East. I am not Palestinian, and I do not speak for Palestinians. I would encourage all of you to go out and talk to Palestinians and hear what they have to say. I promise they've been waiting for you to listen. This is me as an American talking to other Americans about my experience with activism and how I hope that we can learn from the Palestinians and how we pursue our activism moving forward. The second reason I chose this journal entry format was because they were really hard to write, and they took me a long time. And I remember when I initially got accepted into the study abroad program, Jason told us that we'd be keeping journal entries. And everyone was like, what are you the most scared about going to the Middle East? Like, what are you worried about? Like, the current political situation. And I was like, I am so scared that I have to write my feelings down in this journal every day. And Jason is going to grade them. But I'm glad that I did it. I'm very glad that I did it. I look back on it often. And I was so inspired that the second time I went, I also kept a journal that Jason didn't grade this time. But in this case, discomfort was good. So we're going to return to the Tylenol story. Now, I shared this not because I'm against medication. I'm not against Tylenol. I think Tylenol is great. But I think it's an excellent example of the ways that we have become accustomed to avoidant behavior. How many times have you heard people say, oh, I just don't read the news. It's just so sad. It's so negative. I just don't even open the New York Times anymore. The fact is, we are really bad with sitting with difficult realities, especially difficult realities that don't affect us on our day-to-day, that we have the privilege to tune out of. Oftentimes when I talk about the genocide in Gaza, people immediately withdraw. They feel uncomfortable. They don't want to talk about it. It's too hard, which becomes a problem when you're trying to make progress and you're trying to prevent these things in the future. Like I said, Musalaha has a curriculum of reconciliation that has 6 stages. Stage 4 is called Reclaiming Identity, and Salim writes, even if people understand something to be wrong, they won't change unless they are uncomfortable. Without confrontation, there is no reconciliation. Now, this confrontation can be with yourself, it can be with people around you, but it's important that you feel uncomfortable because we have a natural tendency to resolve discomfort. Other things like politics, bureaucracy, conflicting groups, funding, those get in the way of resolving the discomfort, but we have a natural drive to do it. For example, Many of us might have had the natural desire to move out of America after the inauguration. I don't know, that's pretty natural. But we had things like finance and families and external commitments that prevented us from doing that. Which is why when we have headaches, we take Tylenol, because we have access to the resources that allow us to resolve the discomfort. When we witness a crime, we call the police. When we don't like the way our neighbor painted his house, we call the HOA. But what happens when you don't have access to medication? What happens when you don't trust your police? And what happens when you don't trust your neighbor? Now, we saw the result of that in 2020 following the murder of George Floyd. Our resources were no longer effective to address our problems, and as a result, we called for change. It drove many to action. But please understand that even that call for change was a privilege. Many people do not have access to the resource that allows them to resolve the discomfort, or even access to the resources to understand where to start. They don't have the privilege to just check out from the news because it makes them sad. Now, this entry that I'm going to read to you was written within our first week on our study abroad program. And it's important to know that our program initially got postponed because there was a shooting at a synagogue, and there was concerns over whether or not we would go. And I'm very glad that we did go, but that's the background that I'm writing. On February 10th, 2023, I wrote, "Today we are supposed to visit a synagogue for Shabbat. But there was a car ramming in Jerusalem that caused the program guide to move our visit to next Friday. I'm not sure if the world we live in has just made me numb to violence, but as terrible and tragic as what happened was, I personally don't feel any less safe. I feel like since the synagogue shooting that initially postponed the trip, everyone is walking on eggshells, both in what they do or allow us to do and what they say. I guess I feel a sense of guilt that if something terrible were to happen, I have an American passport, money, and a college with an escape plan, whereas Palestinians and Israelis don't. They can't just leave, and many don't want to. This is their home." I watched a BBC documentary before I left for this program where they asked a young Palestinian boy in Gaza why he was fighting, and he responded, "Why not?" He said his parents and family had been killed, his home destroyed, and his life as he knew it interrupted. He had nothing else to live for, so he might as well die for his country and his freedom. I think a lot about that interview, every day in fact, and every time I look outside and see the wall. I've never had that thought, that fear. I'm so lucky and grateful, but so deeply, deeply sad. Why do I get to lead this life while others lead lives like that? How could that happen to someone and they still have hope? Now, at the time I wrote this, the concept of living in constant discomfort, seemingly constant agony, was something I struggled with for a very long time. And I think it's something a lot of people struggle with. A frequent conversation I have when I talk about my time in Palestine is people asking me, "Yeah, that's horrible, but like, how do they keep going? Where do they find the hope?" And honestly, I always hated that question. I used to think it was because I just didn't know what to say, but in reality, I hated it because it was always in response to hearing something really difficult. I would explain that I saw a Palestinian child being arrested in the Old City, that I heard of families being separated between Gaza and the West Bank, never to see their relatives again, that Palestinians were being pushed out of homes that had been in their families for generations, and people would look at me and say, "But where's the hope? Where's the beauty in that story?" Now, I don't hold it against people necessarily. This might be the toughest thing they've ever had to hear, and they're reverting to what they believe to be their right to comfort. They seek out hope as a means of escape. But proper, real hope is not a means of escape, but an act of choice. So today, we're going to explore various kinds of hope and their effect on our engagement. So this first type of hope is passive. This is the avoidant behavior. This is a type of hope that privilege allows you to have. The idea that things in the world are bad, but you hope they'll get better? I don't know. This is the type of logic that says, if I just don't read the news, the bad things aren't happening. On February 13th, 2023, I wrote, "I was talking to Aiden yesterday, and he mentioned that he was refining his connection with God, which I found kind of funny because the more I study religion and the longer I'm here, the the more existential I get. All of this fighting and conflict seems so tragic, yet people are willing to die for this God that they believe in. If any God could want this for his people, could allow things to be this bad, is that a God you'd want to pray to? IDK, this is so existential, LOL. Anyways, love it here. I don't know where I was going with that. I'm going to be honest, you guys. But in the moment, the way I could process it was that the conflict was tragic, but LOL, I like it here. I refuse to engage with the reality for Palestinians. I refuse to have a more nuanced discussion about the role of politics and religion. I refuse to ask difficult questions, and I refuse to interrogate my role in the oppression of Palestinians. I was resigned to simply love it there and move on. I found the beauty that allowed me to ignore the hard part. But even if we do engage with the hard part, this can still be passive. Salim's son Daniel would often travel to other countries to meet with various churches and donors to discuss Masalaha's work. And he said oftentimes people would ask him, as a Palestinian, "Can I pray for you?" And he would always say, "Yes, thank you, of course, I'm a Christian, of course." But recently, he had begun to say yes, but only if that prayer drives you to action on behalf of the Palestinians. It is not enough to pray for us to make yourself feel better. Now, I love that story for many reasons, but one of the main ones is that it highlights the fact that Palestinians do not need our pity. It is sometimes very easy to say, "Oh, look, everything is so sad and tragic." But there's an important distinction I want to make here, that when I say sit in discomfort so that it drives you to action, I don't mean wallow in discomfort because your pity makes you feel better. That's what I'm calling despair. A few months ago, there was a vigil at St. Olaf to mourn the result of the genocide in Gaza. Anyone could go up and talk, and one of my friends, who's a Palestinian, went up and said, "I hate events like these. I hate that you come here and you put the murder and pain of Palestinians on display to make yourselves feel better, simultaneously ignoring the American complicity in this genocide." And he was right. Especially in the age of social media, we have a tendency to display our engagement, to prove how much we really care. Hey, look, I'm going to pray for you. Hey, look, I'm crying for you. Hey, look at me. We seek glory in the suffering of others. But at the end of the day, what have we actually done? Who have we actually helped? So that brings me to active hope. The first type of active hope is deceptive, because it's just passive hope disguised as active hope. The largest problem with this type of hope is that you might not even realize you engage in it. We all like to believe that we care. We engage with issues. If we saw injustice happening, we would say something. There's a book that I love called Untamed by Glennon Doyle. In the book, she is telling her two young daughters about the civil rights struggle. And her younger daughter asks her, "Mom, would we have been marching with them?" And she wants to say, "Yes, of course we would have." But her oldest daughter interrupts her and says, "No, we wouldn't. We're not marching now." I really like that story because it highlights the trap that we fall into when we begin to become complacent. Of course, we all believe that we care or that we know, but are we actually engaging in a way that shows that to be true? Your instinct may be to see, yes, I'm not like Doyle. I engage, and it's good. Okay, fair. To that I ask, have you ever had a really good chicken sandwich? Now, hear me out. Have you ever had a really good chicken sandwich from Chick-fil-A? Because that will change your life, let me tell you. Now, for years, I did not eat at Chick-fil-A because their former CEO, Dan Cathy, was a man who actively supported and endorsed gay conversion therapy. And I didn't agree with that. I still don't. So I'm like, okay, I'm not going to eat at Chick-fil-A. Simple. But one day I'm driving, and I'm like, if I don't eat a chicken sandwich from Chick-fil-A right now, I might die. I needed it. So I'm driving to the Chick-fil-A, and I'm beginning to justify it. I'm like, it's just this one time. How bad can it be? How much gay conversion therapy can $10 really buy, So I go to the Chick-fil-A, and I order my sandwich. And between me placing the order and me getting to the counter, I feel so guilty. I'm like, oh my God, I've just sacrificed all of my morals, and was it worth it for the chicken sandwich? So I come up with a plan. I'm like, I'm going to donate to an opposite organization. I'll buy my chicken sandwiches, and then I'll donate to the Trevor Project because, they don't support gay conversion therapy. And I'll donate the amount of my meal, so it cancels out, and I'll donate in Dan Cathy's name for good measure. So I do that. And then I go on with my day, and I enjoy my chicken sandwich, guilt-free. And then a week goes by, and I'm like, I need another chicken sandwich. I don't know what to say. But this time I got my plan, and I go to the Chick-fil-A, but I'm like, I really like the Trevor Project, so I'm going to get a drink, and I'm going to get a cookie. And then it's like I'm giving the Trevor Project more money. You following? Yeah. Well, fast forward a year, me getting a lot of chicken sandwiches and donating, and it's time to file my taxes. And I sit down with my mom, and I got all my donation receipts, and she's looking at them, and she's like, wow, you've really donated a lot this year. I'm proud of you. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know, I bought a lot of chicken sandwiches. And she's like, what? And I'm like, never mind. But the worst thing about that story is that I sat there and I took the credit for donating. I acted as if I really cared about the Trevor Project so much, and I just donated out of the goodness of my heart. Aren't I a good person? And you might think, as I did, well, bad plus good is like net neutral, right? Wrong. I might have been marching, as Doyle puts it, but I was marching insofar as it benefited me. I was marching because at the end of the march, there was chicken sandwiches. But why does that matter if I still donated to something good, right? What matters because I still produced something bad, which was solely a product of my neglect and my desire to act to benefit myself. Damn the consequences. I would never sit down and write Dan Cathy a check, but I had for a year. And I probably ended up writing him a lot more checks because I thought I was doing something good. I did the exact thing that Daniel told me not to do, which was donate because it assuaged my guilt. And it gave me a free pass to ignore the fact that the way I spend my money matters. There's that line in Matthew 19 where he says, a camel will sooner pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man enter the kingdom of heaven. And I love that line, and for many years, I used that to motivate me to donate, right? Because we all interpret it to me like, don't be greedy. But there's also a requirement that we don't blindly throw money around so that we don't show up rich. There's a requirement for us to engage meaningfully and intentionally so that our good deeds actually have good outcomes. Okay, so if true, active hope isn't any of those things, then what is it? The first type of active hope is hope by requirement. This is the type of hope that some people are required to have because of their circumstances. Their continued commitment to build up and enrich their societies becomes a sign of their belief in a better world. Now, there's a Palestinian concept called Sumud, which means steadfastness in Arabic. The ELCA defines this term as being widely used by Palestinian theologians and others to signify Palestinian resistance to the Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands and peoples. That resistance takes the form of nonviolent advocacy for political change as well as resistance through existence. The concept of resistance through existence becomes especially prevalent for Palestinians living under occupation. In an article titled Settler Colonialism, Conflict and Reconciliation, Salim wrote about the concept of settler colonialism being distinctly different from other types of colonialism because the settler stays on the land, and he begins to reshape it to fit his narrative, erasing any narrative of the other that conflicts with that reality. In the land, this took place when Israelis began changing Arabic place names to Hebrew names, declaring national parks where Palestinian villages used to be, and preventing access to natural resources like the Jordan River, which is now running dry. This practice not only erases the Palestinian, but it erases his history and any proof that he used to exist on the land. Therefore, when an Israeli settler looks out on his Hebrewized land to see a Palestinian, the Palestinian himself becomes a symbol of the reality that there is a Palestine, that those streets used to have Arabic names, and that the land used to be unencumbered by walls. The Palestinian resists through existence. This term, Sumud, is also used to discuss the ways that Palestinian people are resilient. They have endured great tragedy before, in the Nakba, in the Intifadas, in the bombings in Gaza that have been happening since 2013, since the Nakba, and they will continue to endure that tragedy and whatever it takes so that their future children may one day know peace. In his book, A River Dies of Thirst, Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish writes a poem called Routine. Low pressure area, northwesterly winds, heavy showers, gray wrinkled sea, tall cypresses. Today, the autumn clouds let 30 martyrs fall in the north of Gaza. Among them, 2 women taking part in a demonstration to demand a share of hope for their kind. Clear skies, calm blue sea, northerly winds, good visibility. But the autumn clouds, the symbolic name for killing, wipe out an entire family made up of 17 lives. The news searches for their names under the rubble. Apart from that, abnormal life appears to be running its normal course. The devil still boasts of his long quarrel with God. Individuals, if they wake up alive, can say good morning, then go off to their normal jobs burying the dead. They don't know if they will return safely to what remains of houses encircled by bulldozers and tanks and smashed cypress trees. Life is so indifferent. It seems no more than a rough draft of some stubborn urge to have one's presence registered. Equal rights with jackals to enjoy a safe cave. But we have a difficult mission to perform. Mediation between God and the devil to get them to call a brief truce so that we can bury our martyrs. Many Palestinians are not given a choice. They must persist through discomfort, through hardship, through oppression, not only creating a good life for themselves, but simultaneously pushing back against their oppressors, deconstructing systematic violence, and trying to constantly justify to the world why their existence matters, even when the world does not listen. So when you ask me, but Rachel, where's the hope in that? The hope is that there are still Palestinians, and the hope is that a lot of those Palestinians are doing the work to, as Darwish puts it, mediate between God and the devil, despite the fact that it's not a job any of them asked for. And the second time I returned to Palestine, I was asked to accompany the women's group that Musalha was leading to the desert of Jordan. The focus of this group was to take young women, both Palestinian and Israeli, and engage them in a 2-year-long reconciliation process that they otherwise would not have engaged in. Especially for Israelis, if they don't want to interact with Palestinians, they don't have to. So a program like this one was really important for them to work through pre-existing beliefs about the other side, deconstruct bias, and build relationships while still allowing a space for Palestinians to confront their oppressor and the reality of living under oppression and occupation. Essentially work through the 6-stage curriculum that I mentioned earlier. My job on the trip was to go and take notes for the leaders and take a lot of photos. Also, I wish I could stand up here and tell you I knew 3 languages. I did not. Most of the training was carried out in English because, as ironic as it might sound, it was considered the neutral language between all of us, and it was seen as a less biased option than communicating in Hebrew or Arabic. So we had a very long trip there. Half of the group was coming from Jerusalem through the southern Israel checkpoint, and the other half was traveling through the West Bank because Palestinians living in the West Bank can only go through this checkpoint to get to Jordan, which is also after weeks of waiting for their travel plans and their passports to be approved by the Israeli government. Both groups were stopped and questioned. The Palestinians going through the West Bank were stopped for 8 hours. And it's also early July in the Jordanian desert. So needless to say, everyone is tired and hot, maybe wishing they were somewhere else. To add on to that, there's the backdrop of the war. This group was actually supposed to meet in August, prior to October 7th, and then it got postponed. So a lot of things stood in the way of us getting there. But the first night we're there, the first night any of these women are meeting each other, I'm walking to my cabin, and I walk past these 2 girls sitting outside talking. I tell everyone this is probably my favorite photo from the entire trip, but in the moment I took this photo, I did not appreciate the gravity of what I had witnessed. I stopped the photo, and I was like, intern duty's done, got it. But later that night, I was looking through my photos, and I said, oh my gosh, like this photo is historical. These 2 girls around the same age, one Israeli and one Palestinian, are sitting here in the Jordanian desert talking. And they weren't talking because they were required to. The lessons didn't start until the next day. They were talking and laughing with each other 9 months after October 7th and about 23 years after being born into a conflict that has largely been considered unresolvable. They were here with each other because they wanted to be. And then it hit me. Not just them, but this entire group, 10 other Palestinians, 9 other Israelis, had all of their own volition come to the Jordanian desert in the middle of July, in the middle of a war, when neither side has been given any reason to trust the other. And here they are because they want to build a future for themselves and for their families without fear, without conflict, and without violence. Now, I could spend the rest of this talk telling you a million stories like this one, of the resilience of Palestinians and the strength that I have witnessed after these Palestinians I had met went through the worst thing any of us could ever imagine and still kept going. But I'm not going to do that. First of all, like I said at the beginning, I think it is important that you hear those stories from Palestinians. I encourage you to go speak with them. They want to talk to you. Second, this is the hope. But this is the hope for Palestinians. You and me, we don't get to look at this and say, well, these 2 girls got it, pack it up, fire the Middle Eastern coordinator, we're good. Many of us in this room simply do not live under circumstances where our entire survival is entirely dependent on our ability to remain hopeful. So you have to choose it. Now, I could offer you 600 reasons why you should choose it, but regardless of the reason I offer, the reality is we belong to each other. Sound familiar? It's inspiring to me the ways in which Palestinians have managed to maintain this sense of community, no matter how many times their communities are attacked or destroyed. A great example of this is when we were being given a tour of Bethlehem, and our tour guide, Kamal, it's a really good photo of him, I know, it's the only one I had, and invited us over to his house for lunch. Now, it wasn't part of the tour at all. He was going to give us a tour, and then he goes, do you guys want to come have lunch at my house? And we come over, and he's cooked this amazing meal for us. And he showed us his home that had been in his family for generations, and he introduced us to his daughter, who sang for us. And we all ate and laughed together inside this Palestinian man's home, who had absolutely no reason to invite a bunch of American tourists over and cook for us and clear our plates. But that's just who he is. This sense of community is very deeply ingrained in the Arab and Palestinian culture. But in reality, we have all agreed to live in a society together, for better or for worse. So you gotta care about what happens in the society, especially if your access to privilege is the reason others are suffering. There's a story that I love called The Ones Who Walk Away from Almalas by Ursula Guin. The premise is that there's this beautiful utopian society and everything's perfect, everyone's super happy. Not really. But when you're a certain age as a young person, you're brought down to a locked door in a basement. Behind the door is a small room with a dirt floor, and it's cold and damp. And in the room is a child that is neglected and ignored, abused and starved, and you are faced with the reality that not only does this child exist, but his abuse is the reason that you get to live in your utopian society. And you're forced to make a decision there and then. Do you stay in the society knowing that to be true, or do you leave? Do you walk away from Almalas? Like I mentioned before, many of us might believe we would leave. The first time I heard this story, I was like, yeah, I'm leaving. That's horrible. But ask yourself, have you left? You are no longer waiting to see what is behind the locked door. You have seen it. It has been on brazen display online, on social media, in the news, since October 7th in Gaza, since 2003, when we invaded Iraq looking for weapons of mass destruction that never existed, destroying hundreds of thousands of lives in the process. You probably remember the beginning of the longest war in U.S. history in Afghanistan, which started before I was born and is only said to have ended in my lifetime. Since the Gulf War in Iraq and the war in Vietnam, the list goes on and on and on. We like to believe that we are uninformed, that when we were led down to the basement, we closed our eyes and we never saw the child. How could we possibly have known, we ask. But the reality is we've always known. We've always known, and we've always chosen to stay in Amalas, to eat and drink and party in abundance, and to benefit from a government that grows richer by the second from these military escapades and violence. But the beautiful thing about Amalas is there's a third option. It's an option that Gwen doesn't offer in her book, but I'm offering you now, today. You can stay in Amalas, and you can free the child, accepting that doing so might mean your life becomes a little bit more uncomfortable. Things might become more expensive, and maybe you'll lose some friends in the process who really want the child to stay in the basement. But if you want to, you can save the child. That brings me to my last type of hope, which I'm terming unregulated compassion. This is the type of hope that you choose to have because you do not live in a circumstance that necessitates it. But it involves a few requirements. The first is responsibility. This is the opposite of me and Chick-fil-A. This requires effort. It requires research and intention. A few months ago, a Palestinian journalist named Samir Sinjlawi published an article in The Atlantic called "My Hope for Palestine." He made a few bold claims in that article, but one that really stood out to me was his demand that Americans in their protesting stop using slogans like "from the river to the sea." He argued that it was creating even more division, leading Palestinians to the same territorial attitudes that the Israelis had 75 years ago. He argues that what the Palestinians need most now is to find a way out of their hatred for Israelis and engage in only practical peace-building solutions. Now, you can agree or disagree with this article. When I first read it, it certainly gave me pause, and then I read it again, and then I read it again, and I still don't know how I feel about it. It's especially difficult to prioritize Palestinian voices when they're telling you different things. But the important part is that we engage in the critical thought process that reading things like this requires, so that we don't bring undue harm to the people we're attempting to stand in solidarity with. Following October 7th, there were a lot of protests on campus, calling for St. Olaf to divest in their Israeli investments, including their contract with Oracle, and calling for the leadership of the school to acknowledge the reality of what a lot of their Palestinian students would be facing. At the time, I made a very large assumption. I thought, well, everyone here supports Palestine. We all agree, and we all have the same background understanding of what's going on. But that semester, I had some certainly interesting conversations and some downright difficult ones. Some of my classmates, although having the intention to support Palestine, had fallen into very black and white thinking. I saw people begin to post things and say things that were no longer pro-Palestine, but blatantly anti-Semitic, which is not only unacceptable in its own right, it's actively harmful to the movement they cared so deeply about. That hurts the Palestinian cause, because that's not what it's about. Now, while I doubt their rhetoric came from a place of being intentionally hateful, it was still hateful and actively harmful, and it was a direct result of the fallacy that because they were physically present at the protests, they, one, cared more than everyone else, and two, knew more than everyone else. It is imperative that we not simply go through the motions when we engage. So, we've established responsible engagement. The second is our favorite word today, uncomfortable engagement. Now, we've already established that it's imperative to make yourself uncomfortable, but you also have to make others uncomfortable. So that's kind of hard, because it's comparatively easy to walk out on the ledge. It's a lot harder to convince a stranger to follow you. But I want to ask, who here has seen a video of a Karen? Like a video of a McDonald's worker just like yelling at someone trying to do their job. And you're like, this chick, you know? And then someone yells at the Karen, and you're like, yes, this is justice. You're so glad they said something, and you feel vindicated. But when it actually happens in front of us, we become 100 times less likely to yell at the Karen, because no one else is yelling at the Karen. So we think, maybe the Karen is right. Or maybe the other people think the Karen is right, so then I'm going to be the Karen for yelling at the Karen, and it gets out of control very quickly. In political science, we call this the spiral of silence. You don't speak up because no one else is speaking up, and you're scared of being the odd one out. Erica Chenoweth argues that the same logic applies to protests. She says that people are much more likely to join your movement when there's a lot of people already in it, because they fear being socially isolated or singled out for their beliefs. In fact, Chenoweth asserts that a movement only requires mobilization of 3.5% of the population to be successful, but that it's really hard to get to that 3.5%. So when you say, where's the hope, or no one's doing anything, it's because no one's doing anything. You have to be the one to yell at the Karen. You have to start the 3.5%, and that can be extremely uncomfortable. Last year, I was on student government at St. Olaf, and towards the end of October, myself and another senator named Encore, who is absolutely amazing, decided to write a resolution that would be published and signed by St. Olaf SGA. Now, I wrote the first draft of this resolution, and it was very angry. And then I sent it to Encore, and he said, we gotta delete like half of this. And then we went through it some more, and we took out some of the language that we thought would be too biased, because we knew on October 26th, we were fighting an uphill battle. And then we spoke with SJP, which is Students for Justice in Palestine, on campus. We spoke with multiple professors, we spoke with other senators, we spoke with Palestinian students, we spoke with the Jewish Student Org, and we asked for feedback. And I'm sure you can guess, we got a lot of it. And then we edited it again and again, but by and large, people supported the sentiments included: denouncing hate, calling to use the correct language, such as genocide and apartheid, and recognizing that there were many Palestinian students on campus who had families and homes in Palestine that would be affected by what was happening. And then we went to Senate, and we had a 4.5-hour-long meeting, and then I had a 30-minute follow-up meeting about the meeting, and the resolution was voted down. And then there was a vote to keep silent the specifics of what had happened in the meeting. And I was devastated. It was not my most graceful moment, I'll be honest. There was tears, raised voices. And this isn't to point fingers at anyone in specific. People were scared. Certain leadership members at the school had mentioned safety concerns as a scare tactic, and there was a broad concern that students would be angry. So I took the resolution, and me and Encore and two friends of mine that are sitting right there that are amazing, we sat at a table in the Commons. This is not the picture from that. I didn't have a photo from that, but this is another time we sat at a table. And we asked students, if you agree with this resolution, sign it. And we received, in the span of 4 hours, over 200 signatures from students and from faculty. The 2 months that it took to negotiate and receive and implement feedback and fight for the resolution that we believed in were certainly very uncomfortable. But we also talked to a lot of people about Palestine, about what was happening. I had conversations with countless Palestinian students who told me about their families and their fear. We also started the Palestinian Relief Subcommittee, which I had the fortune of working on with two amazing people, Encore and Omar. And we hosted fundraising events and presentations, and this was the beginning of the 3.5%. Because this year, the Senate published a document denouncing apartheid and declaring their commitment to ethical spending moving forward. And it was adopted by every single branch of the student government, and it was sent out to every member of the school. The reality is that that support existed the entire time, but people were scared. People were scared that their beliefs wouldn't be supported or shared, that no one would join them on the ledge, which prevented the action from being taken. So the final requirement of unregulated compassion is actually stage 5 of Salim's curriculum, which is committing and returning. On April 9th, 2023, Jason was right. We were crying. There was a lot of tears. I wrote in my journal that we were leaving Jerusalem, and I was extremely sad, but that it was comforting to know I'd be back next year. On June 8th, 2024, I was back. When I wrote that first entry, I had no idea that October 7th would happen, or that I would apply for the Musalaha internship, or that any of the Senate stuff would happen. I simply wrote that knowing in my heart that I would be back, because I made a promise to myself and to the Palestinians I met, whether they knew it or not, that what was happening to them mattered to me. Almost all of the conversations I had with Palestinians while I was there, especially the first time, were Palestinians thanking me for going, just showing up. They would tell me the story of their lives and how they had been upended by the Nakba and the occupation, and then they would thank me for listening, for seeing their homes. And I would ask, what can I do? What can I do with this information? They would always respond, just tell our story. Tell it to people in America so they know what's happening and they care about us. But that's such a simple request, right? We can do more than that. It is the bare minimum to remember the Palestinians that were killed and the lives that were destroyed using our taxpayer money. When I returned from Palestine the second time, I bought a necklace in the shape of the land that I wear every day, for no other reason than to remind myself of the promise that I made, that I will stand up not only when I am called to, but also when it is necessary, even when it is difficult and even when it takes a long time. The reality is change takes a long time. Next to our inability to be uncomfortable is probably our inability to be patient. And my mother will be the first to tell you that I am the most impatient person ever. But our activism, our hope, has to be consistent or it will fail. And you're not going to be perfect. It is impossible for you to know everything all of the time and make perfect decisions. As my beautiful friends would say, there's grace for that. On February 12, 2023, I wrote about a Kurdish synagogue we visited, and the rabbi we met named Drori. I wrote, one of the laws of the Sabbath is that one cannot light a fire, which is often interpreted to include the ban of electricity. One day, the rabbi walks in to find his mother plugging in a hot plate on Shabbat. He was horrified. But despite the many sins that his mother believed she would be judged for, this was not one of them. She said she kept God close, and she knew that what God wanted was for her two kids who had just lost their father to have a hot meal on Shabbat. And the point of that story was not about biblical interpretation or whether you think she was right, but just that her God told her that loving and providing for her children was more important in that moment than following the written letter of the law. Unregulated compassion is doing the right thing, not the thing that seems right, not the thing that other people perceive to be right. It's asking for forgiveness for breaking the Sabbath instead of asking permission. It's unregulated because it's not conditional. It doesn't hinge on anything else. Your ability to care, to hope, does not hinge on your personal benefit or enrichment or Chick-fil-A chicken sandwiches. And it does not stop because you are uncomfortable. It's all the time, because what's happening to Palestinians is all the time. If you do this, if you engage in this unregulated compassion, you can witness something extraordinary. You can witness history in the making. The program for this speaker series quotes Isaiah 58:12, but ever the student of religion. I want to start a little further back to give it some context. So we're going to start at Isaiah 58:2. For day after day they seek me out. They seem eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what is right and has not forsaken the commands of its God. They ask me for their just decisions, and they seem eager for God to come near them. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves, and you have not noticed? Yet on the day of our fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife, and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast I have chosen? Only a day for people to humble themselves? Continuing on verse 6, is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke. Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter when you see the naked to clothe them, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Further down on verse 9, if you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing of the finger and malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in darkness. Finally, we arrive at verse 12. Only after you have committed to unregulated compassion, only then will you rebuild the ancient ruins. You will raise up the foundations of many generations. You will be called repairer of the breach, restorer of streets with dwellings. I love that passage. I love the imagery and the message of rebuilding, repairing, restoring. A lot of the church services I went to this summer referenced these lines in the context of Gaza. That only after the oppression of the Palestinian people is done away with, only then can Gaza be truly rebuilt. And not just Gaza, but the entire land will be restored and its inhabitants can live in union with one another once the oppression of the Palestinians is ended. But even more so, I love that there is a call for action. There is no room for passive hope in this narrative. There is no restoration without active effort and unregulated compassion. Now, I'm going to end on probably my favorite story to tell from my study abroad, and I've told it a lot, so if you've heard it, I'm sorry. On March 21st, 2023, I wrote, "Today we visited a depopulated Palestinian village called Lifta, and it was so eye-opening. We've been talking a lot lately about how Palestinian life was affected and changed directly after the Nakba, but now we're moving into more recent developments. This village is in East Jerusalem and used to house an entire town of Palestinians. However, the Israeli government made plans to destroy the land and violently evict the native Palestinians from their homes. Now the houses sit there in ruin and disrepair with graffiti and overgrown plants, as Israelis use the land as a public park and use their fountain as a pool. Some of these homes were built hundreds of years ago and they were destroyed in a week. They were destroyed for no reason other than to remove Palestinians from the land. There have been no new developments building-wise. No one lives here. The history of the land has been changed to depict it as uniquely Israeli, and half of it is blocked off by barbed wire. But it was still beautiful. You could get glimpses as to what life in Lifta would have looked like. They had pools and bakeries, mosques and public gardens, grand stone houses with large families and huge arches. We watched as two old men held each other, standing in front of the ruins of their childhood homes, and remembered their lives as children, lives they will never get back. One of the men invited us to join him in his home in Lifta to drink tea and eat pita with hummus. One day he said, "When this is rebuilt, when I return home, I will have you over for dinner and tea, and we will celebrate a free Palestine." I think about that man often. I think about sitting around his table and eating his food in a home that he had no reason to invite me to. And I think of what I would tell him that I did with his story and this information, because I feel responsible. And the reality is, I am responsible. We are responsible. So moving forward, when people ask me, "But Rachel, where's the hope?" I will say, his hope is that his home will be rebuilt. And he keeps it alive by telling that story, by inviting us to dinner. My hope is in me going. It's in the organization, in Musalaha, that I dedicated my time and my resources to. The hope I've seen in my friends is their commitment to protesting, organizing, and fundraising. Sorry. But you must find that hope. And trust me, there's still a lot to be done. The ceasefire does not mean the end of the line. There are still attacks being carried out by the IDF throughout the West Bank. The president just on Tuesday declared that Palestinians have no other alternative than to leave Gaza. Their homes are still rubble. I believe that their homes will be rebuilt. The Palestinians will not be sent on a forced migration for the fourth or fifth time in their lives. So I will help to rebuild, and I will do everything I can to make sure that is true. So please do not ask me, where's the hope? Instead ask, what can I do that demonstrates that I am hopeful? Thank you. I have a quick announcement. I was reminded before I spoke today that there are things you can do today that are here. There's the NJP and some tabling outside. I would really highly encourage you to visit. On your tables, there's a flyer for a film screening and upcoming events that you can do to be engaged right now today. That's my piece. Okay.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much. I'm Jean Wakely. I'm with the WILCA committee here. We would like to take questions now. And if you would be kind enough to just stand up, and I'll bring the microphone to you so that we can all hear your question. So if anyone has a question or want to voice a concern or a care or a thank you to Rachel, just pop up and I'll bring you the microphone. Thank you. I know this is a chatty group. Yes. Sam.
Thank you very much, and thank you for St. Olaf. Thank you for your parents.
Thank you.
I
Thank you
think-
for listening.
You are going somewhere.
Thank you. Hopefully.
And, you are doing something which many of us wish we had a chance to do it. I think 2 or 3 of you will really be good for this nation. So I think the only question I have all the time is that people who are engaged in Middle East situation, I wish they could a little bit read back the history. What is the Palestinian and the Jews? Who's the father? Who fathered these two, Isaac and you know who? These are, they're killing each other. Brothers are killing each other. And honestly, it is not Judaism. It is now political. It is money. It's engagement. Religion has been kicked out, and we wear a cover that we are trying to keep Judaism continue. I think I happen to know Hebrew. I happen to know the history of Old Testament very well, train in that, know that. And what is really I see is nations outside who do not take a chance to learn what you just learned for a short period of years. They stick themselves in there, not because they love the nation or the countries of that, because it makes them look better that way. And I would say that I have been energized by your talk, because
That was the goal.
as a retired person, thousands and thousands of students that I taught in my life, things I have done, I wonder sometimes, do my students really remember Abraham? Do they remember Isaac, and who was the brother of Isaac? The same father, maybe not the same mother, but we all know these are relatives. And we stand there to cheer them killing each other. And we say we come because we want to have peace. I don't shy away. A few years ago when I was still teaching, many years maybe, I would say, our president now, current president, visited Israel, and Netanyahu and him went to the Wailing Wall, and the president he put him a cap on there, so he's rubbing the thing, and he doesn't really know Hebrew, but he's rubbing the thing. And after that, Netanyahu turned to him and said, "You are a God-given, almost like a God sent." And I have a picture. I took a picture. There's a picture that magazine had that I put on my wall or my door in my university. And people look all the time and say, "Oh my God, you're going to be killed." I mean, I say, "No, I'm just putting what I said and what I saw, I read in there." the point is that now we're back to the same thing. The same people, the same two people who said you are God's sent are now still in power. And you see, you heard what he said. You're going to take Gaza?
Well, I don't think he's
I
going, I
mean,
hope not, but.
So I'm saying, can St. Ola produce more than this one?
They got a few more right there.
We need that. We need that, really. We need that. Not because I come from Africa, but I've seen government fights, politics, and so forth, tribalism and things like that. I have a long history of that. But I always look at it and say, as my father said before he died, and I understand that he said, the possibility of the Third World War will start in the Middle East. My father died how long ago? Many years ago. Yeah, about over 100 years he lived to tell the story, to say that. And I'm still saying, oh my God, I hope he was wrong.
We all hope he was wrong.
So again, I said, keep on going and don't look back.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Samuel. To be part of the 3.5%, you know, we have the paperwork out here. You can, I'm going to grab this guy, and then you're right next. So Fred Rogers has a way to be part of that 3.5%.
Rachel, first of all, I want to just thank you so much for your talk tonight. It was just inspiring. I didn't realize that my wife and I were in Ramallah the same time you were in Jerusalem. We
Oh,
were
I
there from
didn't realize that either.
January to April of 23, we were in Ramallah and visiting many of those same places. And one of the things we learned living there with Palestinians for an extended period of time was really the phrase that you mentioned tonight, which I want to just comment on: resistance is existence. That just to do a normal life, to go to work, to come home from work, to go to the store, to prepare dinner for your children, to expect your children will go to school and come home from school. Those seem so normal, but they're not guaranteed in the West Bank.
Not in just the West Bank, Jerusalem.
Or in Jerusalem, yeah,
Throughout-
in
I
any of
mean,
Palestine.
yeah.
In any of Palestine. I didn't mean to be exclusionary, but just where we were living.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're not guaranteed. And yet, we saw people every day get up and do that, expecting it was going to be normal. The Hawara attack happened while we were there. Maybe that was before you came, I'm not sure. But the terrible pogrom that went on in Hawara, where the cars were burned, houses were burned, people were killed, attacked by settlers. And we were going to take a taxi to Tulkarm, which would have gone through Hawara on the way to Tulkarm. And it was fascinating. Some of our friends said, oh, you should not go, it's too dangerous. And other people said, well, why wouldn't you go? The taxis are still running. And people were going and coming to work with taxis right on that same road the next day because they don't have a choice.
They don't have a choice. I mean, even like, we had an incident where we were staying at Tantor where they had closed the checkpoint, the walking checkpoint, where a lot of the staff that worked there were Palestinian, and they would come through the checkpoint every day. And sometimes they just close the checkpoint because they feel like it. And those people couldn't get to work, and the people at Tantor were very nice, and they didn't fire them. That's not nice. That's the bare minimum. But there are a lot of other jobs where if the Palestinian doesn't show up just because the checkpoint's closed, you don't have a job anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I just want to emphasize how profound that notion of resistance is existence is. And I think in our position of privilege, it's hard to understand that fully.
Yeah.
And I appreciate you pointing it out, and I think it's something we can all just think about. Just doing normal life is a huge issue when you live under occupation, and these people have been doing it for 75 years.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm interested in the organization that you were working with.
Yeah.
And the extent to which there was, as far as you could see, genuine communication, if not reconciliation, at least greater understanding, and whether there's any follow-up that you know of. Are these people going back and spreading the word, or what? Can you
Yeah.
say more about that?
So at Musalaha, there's a 6-stage curriculum that is very detailed. Salim has published a 300-plus page book on the curriculum. So I would encourage, I'm not going to go through it right now. But the program takes 2 years. So when we started it, that photo that I showed you, let's go find it. This photo was the first day of the next 2 years. So it's still happening right now. And I was only there for the first stage of 6 stages. And because of the nature of how sensitive it is and the protection of these people, I know that the program's still going on. I personally haven't followed up with any of them because at Musalaha you sign the NDA and then you kind of leave and they're not going to update me on how it's going. But I know it's still happening. A big part of the program and something that was really important to Salim was not just that the reconciliation happens over the 2 years, but at the end of it, the last stage is grassroots organizing. So both groups, the Israelis and the Palestinians, who have worked together for the past 2 years, will come together and work on a grassroots project in their communities. I've seen art pieces before, that was really popular. I've seen protest groups, I've seen there was like a book club one year. So they go out and they do these grassroots things. But it has a particular power in occupied Jerusalem because you're talking to people. Very often what happens is you have like kind of the inner circle of the Israelis and the Palestinians involved, and then you have an Israeli over here who might be interested in the concept of reconciling but didn't show up to the group. But because they trust this Israeli who's in the group and this Israeli trusts this Palestinian, then the Israeli might feel welcomed in. So they might join the book group after the fact, even though they didn't go through the 2-year-long reconciliation process. They now get to engage in the fruits of the labor of the last 2 years of the reconciled group. And then you end up pulling way more people in. And Salim talks about how important grassroots organizing is. He says it's the last hope for Palestinians because they're able to pull in people from communities. And you also have to think these are very hyper-religious communities. You have communities of Orthodox Jews, Orthodox Muslims who are very isolated already and are only coming to these spaces because they trust one person in that group. And so I do think there's a lot of effective change that comes out of that. And I mean, Salim's been doing this since the early 90s, and I think he's seen a lot of success with that and continues to publish updates on reconciliation and hire people to come do research for him. So I think it's been really effective.
Rachel, will you stay a little while afterwards so people can come up and chat with you even
Absolutely.
more? We have one more announcement that we'd like to make. Joe, would you take the microphone, please?
I will. I just want to say a huge thank you to Rachel for taking your time. I'd just like to add that she just returned from 2 weeks traveling abroad. She had 3 interviews today. It was her first day of her last semester. So we are so appreciative of you taking the time to be here with us and sharing the stories and shedding a light on our Palestinian brothers and sisters. So thanks. And if you are now inspired to carry forward that hope, I would like to invite Jonathan Hill from NJPI, St. Olaf English Professor Emeritus, to give us some ideas for how we can do something here in Northfield.
Thank you, Joe. My name is Jonathan Hill. I'm a member of Northfielders for Justice in Palestine, Israel, and it gives me enormous pride to say that NJP partially supported Rachel's trip to Palestine. Normally, when an agency gives money by way of a scholarship to a recipient, the recipient thanks the giving organization. No, we have to thank Rachel. That's the proper way. I have rarely heard such a stellar presentation. her analysis of the ambiguities, the ironies, the self-contradictions of doing good things and being well and trying to be right on the side of justice. A remarkable analysis. Thank you, Rachel. I want to say that on the table you will find at least these two pieces of paper. The full-sized piece advertises trips to Palestine. NJP since 2013 has been given has been giving scholarships to those wishing to travel to Palestine. We've given 9 such scholarships. 3, unfortunately, 3 recipients had to withdraw for very good reasons, but Rachel is the 6th person that NJP has partially funded. We would recommend, thank you, Rachel. We would urge any of you, you don't have to be as young as Rachel, on the contrary, you can be from any stage of life. We urge you to consider applying to NJP for a scholarship. The larger scholarships can help you travel to Palestine. If that is not possible for you, we're equally interested in financing a trip to a conference or an organization or an event in this country which has some kind of Palestine connection. So the larger piece of paper shows you the trips that are coming up to Palestine. The half sheet of paper gives you an overview of all of the Palestinian-related events that are going to be happening in our area over the next 2 or 3 months. Please read them and see if you cannot participate. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rachel.